L'kuta Sichis Chelek Chofhei Vayera Aleph Leilu Nishmis Rabbi Yosef ben Yamin ben Rabbi Menashe Kaltman. Today we are going to learn a Rambam, and the Rebbe will introduce to us a fascinating idea that will change our understanding of what is the mitzvah of Achnasas Orchim. The Rambam sagt, Ugdela Achnasas Orchim be'agbalas pnei Shechina shenemar vayar v'hinei shleisha anashim. The Rambam says, it says in Hilchis Ovel, and where the Rambam begins to talk about acts of kindness, and the Rambam talks about the mitzvah of Achnasas Orchim, of inviting or hosting guests, and he says it is greater than receiving the Shechina. As it says in the Pasuk, and he saw, and there were three men. Of course, this is from the beginning of this week's Parsha, Parshas Vayera, where Hashem reveals himself to Avram, and during this he notices three men, which as we know were actually angels that were dressed up as men, and Avram stops his meeting with Hashem to go tend to the guests. Now, the Rebbe is going to focus on the fact that the Rambam's raya is from the words Vayar v'hinei shleisha anashim. He saw, and behold, there were three men. Von dem, was der Rambam bringt, nur die vier Wörter, und is afilu nit merames auf die weite dicke Wörter durch Moshe sein vergömer. The Rambam quotes these four words, not any other part of the story, nor does he allude to the rest of the story with a word like v'gömer. So it's not like the Rambam is referring to the whole story. The Rambam specifically focuses on these four words. Is mashma as the rayas from the vier Wörter allein. This implies that the Rambam's proof to the greatness of Achnasas Orchim is specifically from these four words. Is nit muvan. Via zoy lernt men up von vayar v'hinei shleisha anashim as gdela Achnasas Orchim me'agbalas pnei Shechina. So the question becomes, where do you see it? All the pasuk tells us is that Avram saw three men. It doesn't tell us what happened afterwards. It doesn't tell us what Avram did. So the question becomes, how do we see in these four words that Achnasas Orchim is greater than receiving the Shechina? The Tmiya is noch größer. The question is even greater. Their mocker from their Maimer is in the Gemara Masechta Shabbos. The source of this teaching is in the Gemara Masechta Shabbos. Und in the Gemara wird gebracht an ander pasuk me'asipur. The Gemara brings a different pasuk from the same story, but a different pasuk. Over there, the Gemara says, "Gedol Achnasas Orchim me'agbalas pnei Shechina. Tichsi vayemer Adonai imna matzasi chen beinecha al nasaver." That Avram said, Hashem, please, if I find any favor in your eyes, please do not leave. And Rashi explains that he left Hashem and went to receive the guests. And so we see that Avram was prioritizing the guests over his meeting with Hashem. So that's the pasuk that the Gemara brings as a very clear, definitive proof that Achnasas Orchim is greater. Das heißt, but from this we see, one, the Rambam is Meshana from the Raya Shebe Gemara. The Rambam is changing from the Gemara's Raya. The Gemara brings a Raya from Adonai imna matzasi chen beinecha. And the Rambam is using, that's the Gemara, and the Rambam is using Vayar v'hinei shleisha anashim. Two, from a Raya velcher is Pashut Mavur. The Rambam is changing, going away from a Raya that's very simple and clear what the proof is, bringt a pasuk wo die Raya is klar nit muvan, and brings a Raya from a pasuk, brings a proof from a pasuk where the message is not so understood, or not understood at all. Three, Heiprich Darkish Rambam. This is contrary to the Rambam's normal style. Mishana Zainu bring in a pasuk Shaleniski begemara klau me'achashu mavur yeser, where the Rambam will change from the Gemara and bring a raya that's not mentioned in the Gemara, when the Gemara's raya is much clearer as a proof. So this is the second question. Question number one is, what is the raya? What is the proof from the fact that Avram sees three men that Achnasas Orchim is greater? The second question is, why does the Rambam change from the raya brought in the Gemara, especially since the Gemara's raya is clearer and more understood how the proof works, and especially since this is different than the Rambam usually does? Now, in Siv Beis, the Rebbe is going to answer the first question. What is Taka the raya from Vayar v'hinei shleisha anashim? Benegeh the raya from the pasuk Vayar v'hinei shleisha anashim as gedei Achnasas Orchim yeshleimar lechaira, as late in the Rambam is the raya from the etzem re'iyah shleisha anashim. The Rambam is telling us the proof is from the very fact that he saw the three people. In a matzah from Vayera elav Hashem, when he's in a situation where Hashem has revealed himself to him, vi pastis as be'es maisa so Avram kukin und der zen shleisha anashim. How is it possible that Avram should see and notice three people? Zen besimas lev, and see them with enough attention, which will lead him to run towards them. When you're standing in front of Hashem, any movement is out of the question. Certainly to give attention to another person or another object. So that's the question. How does Avram notice these people with enough? Sometimes you notice something with the side of your eye. Here, he notices them to the point that he gets up and runs towards them. And the Rebbe is going to elaborate on this point and bring a raya from davening Kriya Shema and from davening Shemina Esra. Mikol shekin from Kriya Shema. But Kriya Shema dav zay bekavana be'ema u'biyira b'resas u'beziyah. Kriya Shema is supposed to be read with proper intent, with proper attention, with fear, with trembling, etc. Because we are reading the document of the king, which he's writing to the people of his country. It has to be treated as if it's something brand new and fresh. So therefore, you're supposed to be totally focused on what you're saying and not on anything else. Similarly, when it comes to Shemina Esra, the standing prayer, since a Yid should see himself as if the Shechina is standing right before him, he has to feel as if he's standing in front of the King of Kings, the Eibishter. Is there din as atonet mafsik sein? The din is he's not allowed to interrupt his davening for anything. It must stand like a servant before his master, on without any movements. As the Shulchan Aruch says, a person shouldn't move. You stand by Shemina Esra with your feet together and you don't move. How much more so it should be by Avram that is standing in front of Hashem in a revealed and sublime way. In other words, it's not like, we'll see in a moment, that he's davening Shemina Esra. Hashem was in front of him. Especially since in this case, it wasn't that we're reading a document that came from the king, which is what it says about Kriya Shema. It's not as if he's standing in front of the Shechina, which is what it says by Shemina Esra. Hashem literally was in front of him. How is it possible that at this very same moment, how is it possible that when Hashem is right there and he's communicating with Hashem in a most real way, he should be able to see three people? Their fun gufa is a raya, and therefore says the Rebbe, this is the raya that the Rambam learns. As that achnasas erchem is greater than receiving the Shechina. Wissentlich as achnasas erchem zogt Shechina azi is gedel von akbalas b'nei Shechina, because Hashem Himself is telling us that inviting guests is greater than receiving the Shechina. Is the riber b'shas akbalas b'nei Shechina is Avram mafsik and vayar v'nishleish ha'anoshim. That's the only explanation that Avram would stop in the middle, that Avram would even notice other people during receiving the Shechina, because the Shechina is telling him that you're supposed to notice other people to be able to invite them in and do achnasas erchem. So the first question that the Rebbe asked, which was, what's the raya from the words Vayar v'hine shleish ha'anoshim? The answer is the very fact that during his meeting with Hashem, he is able to notice other people. The only possibility for that is that because that's what Hashem wants him to do. Because Hashem wants him to notice these guests, because inviting the guests is greater than receiving the Shechina. As bleibt aber die Shaila, but this doesn't answer our second question. Was is der Tam, was der Rambam is Meshana von der Reihe begemorre bringt an der Reihe? What is the reason that the Rambam changes the proof from the Gemara and brings a proof, is a different proof? The Pshita, as the Reihe from Vayar v'nishleish ha'anoshim, is nit mevur yestiv the Reihe begemorre. Even though we just explained the Reihe that he noticed, and we had to be meidich, we had to elaborate that you have Krishma, you have Shemina Esra, and when Kol Shekin Avram is standing at Hashem, he couldn't have noticed anyone else unless G'dei Lachnasas Erchem. But that's an elaborate way of explaining something. Clearly, the fact that he says to Hashem al nosaver, and then he goes to greet the guest, is a much clearer raya. The other Rabbi, on the contrary, not only is that raya not any better, not only is our raya not better, the other raya is for sure better. So even though we answered the first question, it still doesn't answer the second question. Why would the Rambam change and bring the first raya and not the second raya? Meaning to say, the earlier pasuk Vayarvin is Leisha Anoshim, and not the pasuk that the Gemara brings Al Nasaver Malavdecha. In Sif Gimel and Daled, the Rebbe is going to suggest two answers to this question and is going to refute both of them. So here's the first suggested answer. In Masechta Shavuos sagt die Gemara, der Maimon gedel achnas eichem Yesem hakbalas pnei Shechina is verbunden mit der Machlekes hatanoim si kol shemes amurim betera ba'Avram kedesh is kelel echt dem Shem von Pasuk vayemer Adonai im na matzasi chen be'inecha. Other the Shem is chel. So let's go back for a second. The Gemara in Masechta Shavuos brings a machlekes. It says a statement that all the times it mentions Hashem's name, or it mentions a name that could mean Hashem in conversations with Avram, it's holy. In other words, sometimes you could use the word Adnai, and it means my master, and not necessarily Hashem. Sometimes we use it when we daven, and we use it as a name of Hashem. So there's a discussion in the Gemara, if this pasuk, Vayomer Adnai, im na matzasi chen beinecha, is it a Shem Kodesh that Avram was talking to Hashem and told him Al Nasaver, or their Shem is Chayil, or there's another opinion in the Gemara there that this name Adnai is this word Adnai is not a holy Adnai, but rather he was talking to the Malachim. We had a sikha on this in Chelek Chaf. Rashi brings up and Rashi actually brings both opinions. Rashi Alatera brings one opinion that he was talking to Hashem, another opinion that he was talking to the Gadol Sheb Malachim, to the greater one, or to the leader of the three Malachim. So we can use this as an answer as why Rambam doesn't use this pasuk. Und der Far bringt nicht der Rambam the pasuk Vayemer al Nasaver Gemer, weil die Reihe davon ist nicht l'chaladeis. And maybe we could suggest that the reason that Rambam doesn't go this way is because since this raya doesn't work all days, because if you're going to say that he was talking to the Malachim, then there's no clear raya that he was telling Hashem to wait while he goes to tend to the Malachim, because it wasn't like he was talking to Hashem and he told him Al Nasaver. So therefore, the Rambam says, I don't want to use a raya that has different opinions. Especially since in Meir Nevuchim, the Rambam goes with the Shita that he was talking to the Malach. So therefore, we're suggesting that the Rambam doesn't want to use this pasuk because it's shnuya b'machlokes, because it is a controversial pasuk. The Rebbe says that's not a sufficient answer. Rambam clearly paskins in Sefer Hayad. In Nevuchim, he says differently, but in Sefer Hayad, which is a Sefer of halachas, the Rambam paskins that every time it says a name of Hashem by Avram, it's a name of Kodesh, it's a name of Hashem, including this pasuk. So if al pi halacha the Rambam paskins that it's not that this is the types of the pasuk, then he could have used it as a raya. The fact that in the Gemara there's a machlekes is not a good enough reason to say that you can't that you can't use this pasuk. So therefore we're back to our question: why does the Rambam not use the pasuk of the Gemara? Sivdal the Rebbe suggests another answer. In Meir Nevuchim is the Rambam Vayera as the Re'iyah Shleish Anoshim und der Hemshech Stachel is als gewel b'mara hanavua. It says a Hemshech zu Vayera elav Vayera. The Rambam in Meir Nevuchim has a very fascinating way of explaining this Chumash, this part of Chumash. The Rambam in Meir Nevuchim says the fact that Avram saw the three people and then invited them and then gave them food, this whole event was actually did not happen in real life. It was actually a vision that Avram experienced. It was a prophetic vision that Avram experienced. Hashem revealed himself to him, and in that revelation, he saw people, he invited them in, he went to prepare food, they told him these promises that they told him. It all happened b'mara hanavua. It all happened in this vision. Therefore, based on this, we could answer. Al ledasa Rambam is from the pasuk Vayemer Adnai Gemer Al Nasaver Nitakin Raya. Well, the Teichen pasuk is nita sipra murda was a pasit lepel mamish, and therefore, we could say that since this story didn't actually happen, so the fact that he went and he said Al Nasaver is not a raya. Nor ichti amira Adnai Al Nasaver is going to tell from them as Avram Gezem Man Nevuah. Even the fact that Avram said this was also part of a vision, which as if he was watching something happening in the spiritual world, but it wasn't actually happening in real life, and therefore that raya doesn't work as a pasuk. Says the Rabbi Mekana Bar Zayin, you can't use that as an answer. Well, the pasuk Vayarvin is Shleish Anoshim from welchen the Rambam bringt the raya is Lifi Perushim Meir Nevuchim Eichim B'mara Nevuah. So the Rebbe says, well, what kind of answer is that? Also, the pasuk that the Rambam brings is according to the Meir Nevuchim that this whole thing happened in a vision. Also, the Vayar v'nishleish anashim is also happening in that vision. And one is not better than the other. If Adnai Al Nosaver is in a vision, then also Vayar v'nishleish anashim is in a vision, and you can't bring a raya from that either. If you're going to say that, who says? Maybe from the fact that Avram saw this in his vision, in his prophecy, that itself could be a raya. And the very fact that Hashem showed Avram a vision in which Avram was putting aside Hashem to be able to greet the Archim. So from that alone, you could learn that Achnas Archim is greater. The fact that it's in a vision is not a contradiction to the fact that the message is still clear that the Archim were more important. If that's the case, if that's the way you're going, that the raya is from a vision, is adrabah. Demut is mistaber to bring in the raya davke from pasuk vayemer adnai al nosaver. If you're learning it from a vision, then adrabah. On the contrary, you should go with the pasuk of al nosaver. Why? The Rabbi explains. The Rambam is dorten bevayer as their pasuk vayemer lavavaya is their klal. Und von dem Pasuk Vayar v'nishleish anashim nitzavim hebt sich an der Pirut hanevuah from Vayera Lev Hashem. In Meir Nevuchim, the Rambam explains, what do I mean that this was all in a vision? So Vayera Lev Havaya is the title. There was a vision. And then from Vayar v'nishleish anashim, that's the beginning of the details of what Avram actually saw in the Vayera Lev Havaya. As he says in Meir Nevuchim, Hischi Levayer he begins to explain what were the images that he was seeing. And he begins that he started by seeing three people. In other words, until now, without the Meir Nevuchim, regardless of how we're going to end up learning this in the end, way we learned the parasha Pashtus, first Hashem came to him, and then he saw three people. And then the story continues. The way the Rambam explains in the Meir Nevuchim, the Vayera Elav Hashem is not the first thing that happens. Vayera Elav Hashem is the overarching title of what's about to happen. There was a vision from Hashem. What did the vision look like? It begins with the fact that he saw three people, and then the vision continues. Ulefizeh, as Vayar v'hinishleisha anoshim is given b'mara hanevuah, that these three people were seen in this vision, is doch in dem nitokin shum undait wegen der ha'adofe von Achnas Zerchen HaKabbos Pnei Shechina. So now think about this. What Avram saw first is not Hashem. The first thing Avram sees in the vision from Hashem is the three people. There is no Hashem yet that he's putting aside to go run towards these people. So therefore, there's no proof that Achnasas Archim is greater than Hagbos Neshchina. Because the seeing of the three people is not stopping the Shechina. He's continuing to see the Shechina in all of these various different scenes that are taking place. In all of them, that is how he's seeing the Shechina, where he sees three people and then he runs towards them, etc., etc. Das Gufa is the Nevuah. The very fact that he's seeing the three people, that is how he is receiving the Shechina. That is what he's seeing of the Shechina. So therefore the Pasuk, if you're telling me that we're learning it from within the vision, then the Pasuk Vayar v'nishleish anashim tells us nothing. Because that's the very beginning of the Nevuah without any conflict between seeing the people and seeing Hashem. How is he seeing Hashem? By seeing the people. Mashenkin the pasuk vayemer adnai al nosaver, but by the pasuk where he says, even though it's in a vision, he says to Hashem, "Don't go away." Is vibald as the Rabbi starting with us by vision b'mar nevuah, since Hashem shows him in the nevuah. Vi Avram zok shmei b'shnal nosaver, that Avram is telling Hashem, "Don't go." He does balalam, does gelach nazas erchim me'akbalos me'shchina. That would teach us from within the vision that Hashem shows him a vision where he's telling Hashem, "Don't go. I have to tend to the archim." So if you're going into the vision, the only pasuk that works is the pasuk of Al Nosaver. So again, we suggested that the Rambam doesn't want to learn from this pasuk because the whole thing happens in a vision. So we said, first of all, if it's in a vision, then how does the pasuk Vayar v'hinishleish anashim help? Number two, if you're going to say that you could learn from it within a vision, then the first pasuk is the very beginning of the vision, before he's setting aside Hashem, so to speak, because he's seeing Hashem by seeing the three people. It's only where the Hashem shows him a vision of him saying Al Nasaver to Hashem that we could learn that the Achras Erchim is greater. So even if you're going to say that we're learning within the vision, it still doesn't explain why the Rambam is using the pasuk Vayar v'hinish leisha anashim. Neisif al kolza, on top of all of this, b'chlal is deiche gadol lefarish of the Vayar b'sefer hayad al pi pirusha in the tzukim b'sifrei mein nevuchim. In general, it's difficult to say that we're to teach something in a sefer hayad in Rambam, which is where he's saying gdelach nasas erchim, based on how he ties to the psukim in mein nevuchim. V'baldas b'sifrei hayad der montet the Rambam minyanana, because in the Sefer Hayad, Rambam makes no mention of this explanation that it was all in a vision. As is nitke then, kein dibur meiser pel the ganze parsha b'mara hanavua. V'oid v'ikir, and on top of all of this, the most important question, Rambam didan huvel lekamon, in this very Rambam in Hilchas Avel, where the Rambam talks about Achanasas Erchim, which we are going to bring later in the Sicha, is kimat mefurish as given b'poil. It says almost explicitly that this happened in real life. So to say that the Rambam in those halachas is going to bring a raya because we're in a vision, when the Rambam himself seems to imply that it happened in real life, makes no sense. So b'meila, we're back to our original question. We do know that Vayar, we did answer the question of what's the raya from Vayar v'hine shleisha anashim. The raya is the fact that he's noticing them. While he's talking to Hashem, the very fact that he could see them, that in itself shows that they are important to him, more important than Akbalas Pnei Shechina. But why the Rambam chooses the pasuk Vayar v'hine shleisha anoshim as a raya, that has not yet been answered. And the Sifei, the Rabbi is going to say that in order to understand that pasuk, why the raya is from the pasuk, we have to go back to the source, to the Rambam. We have to understand the Rambam, to analyze the words of the Rambam and understand the Rambam, what the Rambam is teaching us. And once we understand the Rambam, we'll also understand that pasuk. So the Rabbi is now going to introduce the Rambam, I mean to say bring in the words of the Rambam, and he's going to ask a few questions on the Rambam, answer those questions. Based on those answers and that understanding of the Rambam, we'll be able to understand why the Rambam goes with the pasuk Vayar v'hine shleisha anoshim. Remember, the verstehen behaktim biur divrei Rambam in the halachas hanal b'sif aleph shon. So let's first understand the words of the Rambam in the halachas which we brought in the beginning of the Sicha, which is Hilchas Avel Perek Yudalid Halacha Aleph. V'zel l'shoneh. Mitzvah sasei shel divrayim is a mitzvah sasei Bidarabonon, the Vaker Cholim, to visit the sick, and the Rambam over there lists a number of other things to be Menachem Ovel, to go to comfort a mourner, etc. Ulalaves ha'erchim, and to escort the guests. Ulis asek, and the Rambam continues other things to be involved in taking care of a person that passed away, etc., etc. The Rambam lists a whole bunch of things that are included in the mitzvah of a Havta l'reacha kamecha, things that you do out of Avos Yisrael. And notice that the Rambam uses the words ulelaves ha'erchim, to escort the guests or to accompany the guests, and doesn't use the word hachanasas erchim. Denach in halacha beis zok the Rambam. Then in the second halacha, the Rambam continues schar halavoyim rubim menakel. The schar, the reward for accompanying the guests, which is basically after they leave the house to walk with them to some distance, is greater than anything else. This is a statute that Avram established, and the way of chesed that he conducted himself. He would feed the passerbys, and give them to drink, and accompany them. And here is the source that we brought earlier, that achnasas erchim is greater than receiving the Shechina. He saw, and behold, there were three people. The livuyam yeser me'achnasasam, and the accompanying them at the end of their stint is greater than welcoming them in. Amru chachamim, the chachamim said, kol she'eini melave, someone who does not accompany their guests, ki'ilu sheifich dam, it's as if he has shed blood. So this is the Rambam. Darfan verstehen, so we have to understand. The Rebbe is going to ask one question here, another question in Sivav, and then in Siv Zayin we'll get to the beer of the Rambam. Verwas sagt der Rambam b'halacha Aleph in der mitzvah seishal divrayim ulelaves erchim und nit beloshna kel lakoil hachnasas erchim. Why does the Rambam use the expression to accompany the guests or to escort the guests and not a more inclusive term, which is hachnasas erchim, welcoming the guests or hosting the guests? The Pashtus Landman. So the simple answer is, as in der Halacha redet der Rambam wegen der Mitzvah Seichel Divreim, was ist verbunden mit Gemilas Chassadim Shebegufay. Then in this Halacha, the Rambam is talking about acts of kindness that we do with our body. Like Levakar Chelim, where a person actually goes to visit the sick. Or Lenachem Avelim, a person actually goes to comfort the mourners. And we refer to in Halacha Aleph, and as the Rambam actually says in Halacha Aleph, these are acts of kindness that a person does with their own body, with their own person, which does not have a limit. Unlike tzedakah, for example, where it says a person shouldn't give away more than a fifth of his earning. So there's a shear. But other inyanim and chesed do have a shear. But inyanim shebegufay, things that I do with my own person, that does not have a shear. But the part of hosting, which includes feeding them and giving them to drink, is more about his possessions. And this does have a limit of how much a person can give. And the Rambam actually in Perush HaMishnayos explains the difference between things that have a shear and things that don't have a shear, things that have a limit, things that don't have a limit. So l'cheira, you could say that l'lavoi sa'orchim, the accompanying of the guests, is something that a person does with their own person. They actually walk out or however they do it with the guest, whereas the feeding and so on and so forth is done with his possessions. And maybe that's where the Rambam uses the term l'lavoi sa'orchim, because he's talking about things that are shebegufay. The subinit can be a maspik, says the Rebbe. That's not a sufficient explanation. Why? Because in Halacha Bey Zog der Rambam as der Chakake Avram Avinu, that this statute that Avram established is Kailol Machil Ovid Rachel Mashkeisan, does include the feeding of the people and giving them to drink. Bizer bringt of them Gdei Lachnosas Erchim Akbalas Pnei Shechina, and that's where the Rambam actually brings the statement that Hachnosas Erchim is greater than receiving the Shechina. If you're going to say that you're talking about acts of kindness that you do with your person, why would you bring in the food and the drink, which is what you're doing with your money, with your possessions? If, as you try to answer, the Rambam is emphasizing the mila, the advantage, the importance of the accompanying, then the Rambam in Halacha Beis should have said this is the statute that Avram established, that he would accompany his guests. Or at least say it as a side thing, that after he would feed them, he would accompany them. To emphasize that we're talking about the importance of the accompanying, which is something that you do with your own person. And that all the details are necessary, and they're all part of Gdei Lachnas Erchim. So in that case, why in Halacha Aleph does he, where he introduces the mitzvah, does he say L'lavis Erchim? You can't say that L'lavis Erchim is Kasher Begufay, because the Rambam includes all the parts of Achnasas Erchim in the mitzvah, including the eating and the drinking, or the giving food and giving to drink. So why in the first halacha does it say L'lavis? Und es zadege gadol immer als der Rambam bringt die Protei advarim wegen Achnasas Erchim nor als hakdama b'chtei nachmar aris bringen Meila Salavoya. And it's a doichik to say that the Rambam is bringing all of these details just as an introduction to emphasize the importance of the accompanying. It's doichik to say that if that wasn't part of the mitzvah, then this mitzvah that Rambam is talking about, he wouldn't have said it. Especially, the Rebbe is going to explain why is it a doichik gadol, especially as the Maimer was that bring b'saf halacha amru chacham kol shenim alav kilu shevich dam, at the very end of the halacha, where the Rambam says that if you don't accompany your guests, it's as if you shed blood. Is madgish efen starksten even the nechitzas v'gedel alavaya. That already emphasizes on the highest possible way the importance of accompanying. So to say that the Rambam has to also include other things to emphasize the importance of it is a doichik, because if you want to know how important it is, the Rambam tells you how important it is. If you don't do it, it's like you killed someone. It's like you shed blood. So we know that it's very important. So if the Rambam includes other details in the mitzvah, it's not to emphasize that importance. It's because the Rambam holds that those other parts are also part of the mitzvah. Machelu, mashke, etc. So in that case, why in Halacha Aleph does it say L'lavis Erchim? So just to pause for a second, we are trying to understand our initial question in the Sikha, or the second question of the Sikha, why the Rambam changes the Raya from the Raya of the Gemara. We suggested a number of answers. The Rebbe was not satisfied with them. So the Rebbe said, let's learn the Rambam. Let's go back to the Rambam. Let's learn the text of the Rambam, and let's see if that can answer our question. And in order to do that, the Rebbe says we have to learn the Rambam. What is the Rambam? And the Rebbe has two questions on the Rambam. The first question he has on the Rambam is why the Rambam uses the term lelavoi sa'erchim, to accompany the guests, and not hachnasas erchim. And you can say that really it's because he's focusing on gemilas chasadim shebegufei, acts of kindness that a person does with their person. You can say that's the pshat, because you see that in halacha beis the Rambam includes the other details of achnasas erchim. So clearly the Rambam holds that achnasas erchim includes everything. So then why say just lelavos? In Sifav, the Rebbe is going to ask a second question. The Rambam fängt an schar halavaya merub min hakel. The Rambam begins halacha beis by saying that the reward for the accompanying of the guests is greater than everything else. Then the Rambam continues, he concludes the halacha, anybody that does not accompany his guest, it's as if he has shed blood. And then in halacha gimel, the Rambam brings something very similar. He says, Bezdin would establish people, agents, that their job was to accompany people from place to place. And if they were lax at this, it's considered as if they shed blood. What is the simple understanding? Why is this act of shedding blood? Is there time was the head of the levaya is kilo shever damim? But mit levaya werd bavarin tam zolem eirach netagene bederach. Because by accompanying this person, the guest, you are making sure that he shouldn't get killed along the way. We did I was the Gemara brings from Masechta Seita, as the Gemara brings from Masechta Seita. Masechta Seita, the Gemara brings with regards to the Egla Arufa, that they found a person dead and they don't know who killed him. So Bezdin from the closest city has to come out and has to say, our hands did not shed this blood, our eyes did not see this. So the Gemara says, would we think that Bezdin is killing people, is spilling blood? But it means that we didn't see him hungry and not give him food, and we did not let him go without levaya. In other words, what Bezdin is saying is, had we let him go without levaya, we would have been responsible for this death, because he died, he was killed, possibly because he was alone. So we see that what is the purpose of the levaya? Why is the lack of levaya, the lack of accompanying the guest, called a sheifech damim? The answer is because if he travels alone, it's very dangerous. Someone could stop and kill him. Is nit move on, but based on this, the Rebbe has a question. Once the Rambam tells us that the importance of the accompanying is so great that the lack thereof is considered killing someone, shedding blood, is to say that the reward for it is greater than anything in comparison to the fact that you didn't shed blood seems very small. As the expression goes, the smaller thing is included in the greater thing. Why the need to say both? In other words, if you were to say to someone, if you don't do this, you're considered a murderer, and if you do this, I'll give you a reward. The fact that I'm not a murderer is so much more powerful than the fact that there's a reward. So why does it have to say that there's a schar for levaya in order to emphasize to us how important it is, when in a few lines later the Rambam is going to say that if you don't do levaya, it's kilo sheifech damim. That's a much, much bigger statement. And why the need to say both? And now the Rebbe is going to answer the question, and in order to answer the question, these questions in the Rambam, to understand what the Rambam is saying, the Rebbe is going to revolutionize the mitzvah of achnasas erchim. What is the mitzvah of achnasas erchim? How does one do it properly? Here it goes. In general, in any act of kindness, there are two elements. Aleph, der nifel von der mitzvah, the result of the mitzvah. Was mit sein Meise von gemilas chasadim is a malach chisaron shel chaveri, or the bringt telas chaveri. Through his act of kindness, he filled a void that his friend was experiencing, or he brought some benefit to his friend. Person was poor, he needed lunch, and this person bought him lunch, and now he's not hungry anymore. So the one element here is that the guy's not hungry. Beis, then there's the Pu'ul Mitzad Gavra, the Midas HaChesed from the Gimel Chesed. Then there's the act of the person, the fact that he engaged in an act of kindness. So there's the result of it, that the recipient received something, and then there's the fact that the giver conducted himself in a manner of kindness. And similarly, in Achnas Zerchim, we have the same two elements. The things that the guest receives from the host, such as food, drink, a place to sleep, etc., the various different things that the host does for him. Beis, then you have the midas hachesed from the balabais hamareach, the kindness from the host, the isanyinus v'simas leiv, the attention and the caring that he shows to the guest. In other words, you have a person that comes into the house, you invite someone into the house and you give them a meal. A plate full of food and a second helping and so on and so forth. So first and foremost, the guy feels satisfied. He ate, he's not hungry anymore. But there's also the fact that he feels that someone cares about him. Someone gave him food and extra food and so on and so forth. There's the act of chesed that is coming from the host. Says the Rebbe, when we talk about acts of kindness, and in general by mitzvahs between one person and another person, what's most important is the benefit and the kindness that the recipient receives. Und die Midas HaChesed von dem Adam HaGoimel Chesed is Negea Bikir, nicht so am HaKabbalah Chesed, sondern the Gavra HaGoimel Chesed. The kindness that it involves is more relevant to the giver, not to the recipient. If the recipient is hungry, he doesn't care why the giver is giving it. He got his food. He got what he got. The fact that this is done in a manner of kindness, generally speaking, the fact that it's done in a manner of kindness is really more in the realm of the giver, of the host, of the person that's giving the tzedakah. We find by tzedakah that if somebody loses a coin and a poor person finds it and then goes and sustains himself with it, is a mekayim mitzvah tzedakah. The original owner of the coin who lost it fulfilled the mitzvah of tzedakah, because despite the fact that he wasn't planning on giving it, not only he didn't give it happily, he wasn't planning on giving it, but it doesn't change the fact that the recipient found it and fed himself or his family with it. So therefore, you see that when generally in Gemilas Chesed, the focus is on the recipient, that he got what he needed. However, by Achnasas Orchim, there is a new chiddush, something new and different. The feeling of kindness of the host is negeyat to dem nifel, is relevant, is important to the end result. The pu'ulas was betut fahren eirach, that the acts that are being done for the guest have to be done with kindness. The Achnasas Orchim darf getan werden beöfen as der Eirach soll margisch sein. As the Achnasas Orchim has to be done in a way that the guest has to feel as alle pu'ulas von dem Ma'areach b'shviloi, that all of the acts that are being done by the host for the guest, it's because he cares. Because he has feelings towards this. Because he loves this other person as a fellow Jew. As the Rambam himself says in this halacha, that all of these mitzvahs of Levaya and Nichum Avelim and Bikur Chaylim, it's all part of Haftal Arecha Kamecha. So the person who's sitting in someone else's house and is being served food has to feel like he's wanted there, and has to feel like the person is actually being kind towards him because he cares about him and because he has obviously Yisrael towards him. Und das drückt sich aus in dem Chiyuv l'Lavis Orchim. And where do you see? How do you know what he's thinking? How do you know how he feels about this? This expresses itself in the obligation to accompany the guest at the end. Levaya is not really something that the Eirach needs. The Eirach is used to traveling and sometimes travels by himself. What the Eirach needed was food or a drink or a place to sleep. And now that need was filled. It's not part of his needs as a guest, as it would be to provide him with food and drink. No, it's these mitzad midas gemilas chasadim. Accompanying someone is because you have a feeling of kindness. And therefore, even after they part ways, so to speak, he leaves his house. So he's not anymore his guest. the mitzvah of levaya continues. Because when a person goes out of his own house to accompany his guest, then the guest feels as that everything that happened until now, the food, they're giving him, providing him food and drink, etc. Kumtas mitzadem hergesh alev from the Malbais Samarech comes from the feelings of the heart of the host. As that he cares about him and he wants him to have everything that he needs. So the Rambam now, the Rebbe now, attached in the Rambam, that when it comes to Achnasas Erchim, it's not enough the result action that the person has supper for tonight. The person has to know, has to feel that what he's being given as an oirach is being done with the whole heart of the host. And how does he know that? How does he know that it's being done with the whole heart of the host? Is if the host accompanies him. If even after he's done his mitzvah, he still cares about him enough to go with him. Which means, as we'll see in a moment, that's not so much just to watch out to make sure that nobody kills him. It's also to give him a feeling of being wanted, of that someone cares about him. And this is how this is the flow in the words of the Rambam. The reward for accompanying a guest is greater than everything else. This is the statute that Avram established. This is all the quote from the Rambam still. And this is the way of kindness that Avram conducted himself. He would feed them, and he would give them to drink, and he would accompany them. The statute that Avram established is not just the fact that you accompany the person. The statute that Avram established is an attitude with regards to the whole idea of inviting guests. As Avram established the idea of inviting guests in such a way that it should consist not only of the actual act and the end result that the oirach is receiving his needs. Avram says, you want to do achnasas erchim, it has to incorporate the feelings of the host. But thus is the derech chesed nagba, and that is the way of chesed that Avram conducted himself. As levaya sa'erchim kum zusammen mit dem was Michael that the accompanying of the guests comes together with the food and the drink. So in other words, it's not that the food and the drink is irrelevant. The food and the drink has to be done, and it has to be done together with melave, because then it shows that the food and the drink is included in that. And now we can understand what the Rambam says at the end. Amru chachamim kol she'enei melave. Where the Chacham said that if you don't accompany your guests, it's as if you shed blood. And that says, this is actually a continuation of the same theme. Earlier we asked, why do you have to say both? Because the Kilu Shefech Damim is much greater. So why say Schar HaLevaya? The Rebbe is now teaching that Schar HaLevaya is telling us that the Levaya, what's the Lashon? Schar HaLevaya Oila Merubah Min HaKoil is because the Levaya, the accompanying of the guest, shows that the whole Haknasa was done properly. And now when he says at the end that it's, if you don't do it, Kilu Shefech Damim, he's not saying something greater, he's actually continuing the same thing. He's continuing the same thing with the importance of Levaya. The Rambam doesn't mean that if you don't do it, it's going to cause him to be killed along the way, which is how he initially understood it, which is why we thought it was such a fundamental thing. The Rambam is referring to the feeling of the oirach's blood being spilled by the ma'areach. B'shas the ma'areach is nit melave. If the host does not accompany him, zeter as es felt is anyenus und übergegebenkeit. The guest feels that the host lacks caring and lacks devotion. The midas hachesed in their pu'ula. He lacks the kindness in what he's doing. Gate im nit ein die achnasas erchem. So now he doesn't feel welcome. Un azil sumka v'asichivra. What happens is, the azil sumka v'asichivra means his face changes colors. He turns red and then he turns white. This actually is what he means by shvichas damim. The Gemara says in Baba Metzia that Amal ben Pnei Chaveroi ki'ilu sheifach damim. If you embarrass someone, it's as if you spilled his blood. Says the Gemara, Shaper Kamras, what you're saying is true. How do I know? The chazina lay, because we could see it. You see that someone is embarrassed. First he gets red, and then he gets pale. Basically, the blood rushes to his face, and then the blood leaves his face. You're being sheifach dam. You're drawing away the blood from his face. So shvichas damim doesn't just mean literally killing the person, it means embarrassing the person. He feels embarrassed, and he feels like you're shedding his blood. So the Rambam is saying that schar halavaya b'ruv min hakoil. The schar halavaya, the reward for levaya, for accompanying the guest, is more important than anything else, because that's where you see that the host actually cares about the person and is doing so from a place of kindness, of caring and devotion towards his guests. Because if you don't do it, you're embarrassing him. You're telling him, I don't care about you. Yeah, you're hungry, I'll give you food, but get out of my life. And chas v'shalom for a person to give that impression to an oirach, because if you do so, you're being sheifach dam. You are embarrassing the person and you're making him feel terrible. Like the Rambam says in Hilchis Matnas Aniyim that when you give tzedakah, it has to be done with a pleasant countenance and with a joyful demeanor. And the giver should commiserate with him about his challenges. But if you're giving tzedakah with a unpleasant countenance, and his face is buried in the ground, he lost his chus. Because what kind of impression are you giving this person when you're giving him tzedakah and you're not interested in giving it? So similarly, when it comes to the mitzvah of achnasas orchim, if you don't want to actually do it, and the oirach knows that you don't want to do it, you're embarrassing him. You're spilling his blood. So the Rambam is saying that you have to, the levaya is the most important, because that's how the oirach knows that you care about him. And if you don't do so, it's like you're shedding his blood. So this answers the question first, before we get to this next paragraph. This answers the question why the Rambam says both, because the Rambam is not talking about two outcomes of levaya, positive or negative, doing it or not doing it. The Rambam is teaching us how to do achnasas orchim. Achnasas orchim has to be done with the whole heart, and therefore the levaya is so important, and therefore the lack thereof is ki'ilu sheifach damim. They're actually both saying the same thing, which is why they both need to be there. And now we can go back to our first question on the Rambam in Seif Vav, I believe. In Seif Hey, actually, why does the Rambam use the term lelavos ha'orchim and not achnasas orchim? Al pi zeh move in the time of the Rambam tell to us from mitzvah achnasas orchim, nor the meaning from lelavos ha'orchim. Warum dafke in dem direkt sich anike by mitzvah achnasas orchim? Because that's where you see by the lavos, as we just explained at length, by the accompanying of the guests. That's where you see the most important part of the mitzvah. The simas lev to the oirach, the attention to the guest. Nachmer b'shas es feld in levaya, dem feld eichen the mitzvah achnasas orchim in der chilu shtia was hat ihm gegeben genau. And in addition, if you are lacking the accompanying, then everything else that you did is also lacking. So therefore the Rambam says lelavos ha'orchim in order to emphasize that the most important part is to care about the guests. And that's what the Rambam says, the lavis ha'orchim, because the accompanying shows the care, the interest, the kindness towards the guests, and that's the most important part of achnasas orchim. So now we understand the Rambam. The Rambam phrases himself the way he does to emphasize to us that the most important part of achnasas orchim is to care about the guests. Now do we understand the Rambam, the other parts of the Rambam. Does the time of us the Rambam brings why the Rambam uses in order to bring a raya, a proof that achnasas orchim is greater. The Rambam brings the Raya from Pasuk Vayera v'yarvinish leisha nashim unas mishana from the Gemara was lent us up from Pasuk Vayemer Adnai al Nosavim. Now we can understand. why the Rambam uses this pasuk and he changes from the Gemara. It's connected to the whole theme of the halacha. The statute that Avram established and the way of kindness that Avram conducted himself, that a fundamental part of Achnasas Erchim is the kindness that it entails. The caring and the attention to the guest. It's not just when you're actually doing the act of Achnasas Erchim, when you're actually feeding the guests and whatever comes after that. But even before you feed the guest, take it as soon as he sees them and he welcomes them in, what's relevant here is the attention and the caring about the guests. The Rambam wants to tell us, as he's been telling us throughout this whole halacha, that the ikir of Achnasas Erchim is the kindness that it entails, the attention that it entails. And therefore, when does that begin? That begins from the moment that you see the oirach. As soon as you see him and you welcome them into your house, from that point on, the oirach has to feel that he's wanted and that he's loved and that you are totally attentive to him and caring about him. Und das liegt sich aus im Pasuk Vayera Anashim. And that is seen in this pasuk that Avram saw the three people, as we explained in Siv Beis, that even though he was sitting with Hashem, he saw them, he noticed them, and he cared about them to go and ran towards them. And at Mesim Leiv given to the Gimel Anashim, he gave them attention in mitin Akbalas Pnei Shechina while he was meeting with the Shechina. So therefore, if he would have gone to the other pasuk, you would have seen, that he fed them, he took care of them, but you wouldn't have seen the attention that he gave them until the end of the story when he's melava them. But when the Rambam brings the pasuk Vayera Anashim, the Rambam is emphasizing that from the very first moment, Avram didn't just take care of them. He didn't just feed them and give them their needs. He actually cared about them and paid attention to them, despite the fact that he was in the middle of talking to Hashem. And that's the greatest raya, that Gdei Achnasas Erchim, proper Achnasas Erchim, paying attention to your guests is greater than Akbalas Pnei Shechina. And based on this, the Rabbi is going to answer in Sif Yud one more or two more questions, which is going to touch upon the fact that these people were actually malachim, they were actually angels. And the question is going to be, how do you actually learn a halacha from a story that it wasn't really Achnasas Erchim? They weren't Erchim, they were angels. Sif Yud. Al Pikol Anal, Kenman. We could answer another question. At the end of the day, it was obvious that by feeding them and giving them to drink, Avram did not fulfill the mitzvah of Achnasas Erchim. These were angels, they don't need to eat. So he wasn't really feeling a need. Especially according to the opinion that they didn't actually eat, it just looked like they were eating. And even though there's opinion that they were actually eating, it wasn't because they needed food. They were angels. Angels don't need food and drink. They did it to honor Avram. Avram worked so hard to prepare the food, so they ate the food. Or as the rule is, when you go to a place, you follow its customs. So since they were on earth, and in earth people eat, so they ate. But the reality is that they didn't need to eat. They didn't need this food. This wasn't actually welcoming guests and acting kind. And this raises 2 points in a question. If this wasn't actually Achnasas Erchim, you're not allowed to stop your meeting with Hashem. How could you say that Avram made this mistake and left Hashem in order to welcome guests, which wasn't even a mitzvah because they weren't actually guests? The second point is, how can we learn from it? We're learning a din, an actual din, that Achnasas Erchim is greater than Akbalas Pnei Shechina from a case that wasn't actually Achnasas Erchim. So there's 2 points. Number one, how could Avram have done it? And number two, how do we learn from it? Therefore, we must say that even though these people were just in the form of men, they weren't actually men. Nevertheless, nothing was actually lacking. It's not that it was just because it looked in his eyes as if he was doing the mitzvah. We must say that if Avram did it, he was actually doing the mitzvah of Achnas Tzarchim. In other words, despite the fact that these weren't actually people, and despite the fact that they don't eat, that they don't need food and they don't need drink, what Avram did was actually Achnas Tzarchim, and therefore Avram was allowed to walk away from the Shechina, so to speak, in order to take care of these people, and therefore we could learn from it. How does that make sense? So it's based on how we've been learning the inyan of Achnas Tzarchim until now. Ikir inyan Achnas Tzarchim is mudgish nit auf azay viel in pulas achevtze von achilu ushtia was der Erech bekommt. The main element of Achnas Tzarchim is not so much about what the guest is receiving, the food, the drink, etc., nor in the midas achesed derech chesed sheba. The primary element of Achnas Tzarchim is the act of kindness that's coming from the host. There's simas leib und this anyanus betzadem gavra, the attention and the caring that's coming from the person, the host. Der Balabayas Amareach from the host to the guest. Und die Maisa Agavra Vesimas Liboy is in der Achnos Tzarchim Avram Avinu given b'shleimus. And the act of the person, of the host, and the attention of the host in the case of Avram was 100% complete. In other words, he did the mitzvah of Achnas Tzarchim despite the fact that the recipient didn't need some of the things that he gave him. So this is point number one. Point number one is that despite the fact that they did not need food, what Avram did was Achnas Tzarchim. In other words, because the Achnas Tzarchim is so much about the act of the host, and Avram was a perfect host, so Avram did the mitzvah even though the recipients didn't need it. It's as if to say, if a person gave, not a good example, but if a person gave the guest 3 plates of food and he only wanted 1. So technically you could say, there's other 2 plates. There's no mitzvah. He ate. He's satisfied. But the truth is, no, there's a mitzvah there because he shows that he cares about him. So even though they won't get eaten, but nevertheless, the fact that he gave them and he cared about him. Similarly, what Avram did was an act of caring. It was an act of attention. It was an act of being there and acting in a way of kindness for his guests, and that he did do despite the fact that the recipients weren't real. Nachmer. There's another point over here. Also, on the end of the recipients, it was actually done in a complete way. The fact that the guest is satisfied, feels content because of the attention that he got from the host, is could be by angels too. The fact that the angels feel welcomed, that works. But especially when they come in the form of humans and they need to be treated in that way. Especially when you're talking about the attention came from Avram Avinu, who is so precious by the Eibishter. As it says in this parsha, the word Kiyadaitiv, I know him, and Rashi says this a lashon of Chiba, I cherish him, I love him. And in general, the Avis were a Merkava, they were a chariot, which means they were totally bottled to Hashem, they were one with Hashem. Which their Maila, their uniqueness is greater than the angels in a revealed way. So the Malachim were getting attention from whom? From Avram Avinu. The fact that Avram Avinu, who is cherished by Hashem and is Merkava to the Eibishter, and is Chaviv by the Eibishter, and Avram gives them attention, is so certainly they felt welcome, and they felt loved, and they felt cared for, because even though they didn't need the food, per se, and they were just eating it for the sake of Avram, but the fact that Avram cared about them and gave them attention, that made them feel very good. That even though they're malachim and they're on a lower level than Avram in a certain sense, nevertheless, Avram was there for them. So once we understand that Achnas Tzarchim is not so much about what the recipient receives, in actuality, food, drink, but it's about the feeling that he gets from the fact that the Gavra, the Areach, the host, is caring about them and and giving them attention. So this explains why the Rambam says lalavis ha'orchim, because that's where you see the love and the attention from the me'areach. And this is why the Rambam learns from Vayera v'hine shleisha anoshim, because that's where you saw that he cared about them from the very beginning. And this is also why we can even learn from Avram this din, because Avram did all of that for the malachim, despite the fact that some of the things that he did weren't necessary. And with this, we have learned a brand new understanding of the mitzvah of achnasas orchim, how it's different than other forms of gemilas chasadim. And when we learn this from Avraham, and when we incorporate it into our own lives, we have fulfilled this mitzvah of achnasas orchim on a whole nother level.